Well, thank you very much indeed, Annette, and thank you, Ambassador Roach. I hope you've had a good time your first 3 months in London, that we Brits are being a lot nicer to you than we were 200 years ago. So people have advised me to bring my flak jacket today, confronting a few Americans about this, probably the worst moment in American-British relations of all time, I suspect, even worse than the War of Independence. I mean, to burn the White House and Congress seems to me to be going really pretty much to the limit. But I haven't bought my flak jacket because I hope you will think that, I don't know whether you've read the book, but I'll try and in 20 minutes or so give you I hope a fair account of what actually happened. I think mistakes were made on both sides, serious mistakes were made on both sides. I would suggest to you more on the American side than on the British. I'm being very fair. and I think it was one of the most extraordinary episodes in our relations with each other. A quite extraordinary, bizarre almost event, made most bizarre by what happened just before the British burnt the White House. And I'll tell you the story, which many of you may know already. So what you have is, to give you the wide context, you have this war going on between Britain and France, a huge world war between Britain and France, in which the British, at some stages, were fighting for their survival. And the Americans were friends of France, and they wanted to trade with France. And we thought this was a bit rich because we were fighting the French, but the Americans. So we had to intercept your ships. May I say your and we? I don't see why I shouldn't do that. We had to I know there are one or two friendly people here on the right side. But we had to intercept American ships because they were trading with France. We couldn't have that. We had a boycott of France. We had a blockade going on. But rather arrogantly, very arrogantly, and quite wrongly, the Royal Navy was also impressing American sailors to fight on British ships. But we needed the men to man the sails, and so we said, well, a few Americans around, let's grab them too. After all, they're Brits, they were born in Britain or born as British citizens. Let's grab them and make them man the ship. And so we were impressing, very arrogantly and wrongly, impressing American sailors. The Americans in 1812 decided this was simply all unacceptable. Not only that, but they also decided that Canada was ripe for invasion. And they went into Canada, invaded Canada, declared war on Britain, and invaded Canada. And incidentally, in 1813, burned the Parliament in York, which is now Toronto. What happened in York, Toronto, was, however, different from what happened at the White House in 1814. I believe the American High Command did not order the burning of the Parliament in York. I believe the American High Command was rather appalled when it found its soldiers running amok and burning the wooden Parliament in York. Whereas what happened, as I shall tell you, in 1814, a year later when the British invaded Washington, was a deliberate act of state. There's no question. The High Command, British High Command said, burn the White House and burn Congress. Now that clearly was going a lot further than the Americans had gone a year earlier. Anyway, so we had the situation where the Americans declare war, stupid really, frankly, declare war on with the tiniest navy, one of the tiniest navies in the world, on the country with the biggest navy in the world in 1812. And they did very well. The Americans scored a few victories over the Brits, but they got nowhere in Canada. It didn't really hurt very much. I mean, the Brits successfully the Canadians kept them out of Canada, and we were fighting Napoleon. I mean, the thing was a painful sideshow, really boring. We were being stabbed in the back by you guys. I mean, come on, we were fighting for freedom, serious freedom in Europe. And I mean, I keep looking at the ambassador, why not? And you guys were bashing us up when we were fighting for freedom over something that was comparatively trivial. I think I genuinely actually mean that. I mean, really, what was going on? You can't trade with France. Well, of course you can't. Impressing your men, well, that's a bit scruffy of us, but come on. Anyway, so this rather largely forgotten war, from a British point of view, and even the Americans too, I think, I mean, it's regarded as far less salient than the Civil War and than the War of Independence and so on. Anyway, So there we were. After Napoleon abdicated in 1814, the British suddenly thought, look, this American war has been going on in the background, we've got to sort this out. So let me now tell you about the cast of characters. We have the British with an Irish general who was ordered by Whitehall to go and give the Americans a good drubbing. These Americans are being an absolute pain in the neck. They're fighting this war against us. Let's give them such a drubbing that they'll want to stop this war. They'll stop it from their point of view. We'll stop it from our point of view. Let's end this war now and go and give them a good drubbing. So Robert Ross, Major General, goes across the Atlantic with a fleet of about 50 ships, 4,500 really grizzled veterans who've been fighting the Americans in the peninsula, in the Mediterranean, redcoats with a huge experience and extremely brave and courageous and absolutely furious at not being able to go home to their wives after the Peninsular War. They're driven off to America. So off they go. Robert Ross, the general, the commander-in-chief, Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, devious character, a vice admiral. He was the boss of the task force. And the really key man is Rear Admiral George Cockburn. Now, Cockburn had been in America, in Chesapeake Bay, for a year before all this. 1813 he was there, and he'd been creating havoc around Chesapeake, burning villages, burning towns, fury. The Americans loathed him and feared him. He was a really ruthless, fiery man. And people hated him in America. There was a huge reward offered for him, $500 for each of his ears. And Cockburn was bad news to the Americans. Cockburn was quite clear what the Brits should do. They should send a big force across the Atlantic. They should then go and burn Washington. No nonsense, quite straightforward. There was, on the American side, a rather more flawed collection of people, I suggest to you. A rather more flawed, F-L-A-W-E-D, collection of people. The president himself, a magnificent intellect, of course, James Madison, the fourth president, the one who wrote the Bill of Rights, the one who fathered the Constitution, a very serious, rather studious, severe man, dressed in black most of the time. One visitor to the White House described him as a schoolmaster dressed for a funeral. And he had this wonderful wife, Dolly, who was a tremendously outgoing, quite a contrast to him, a wonderful partner. They loved each other very much, great partnership. And she was a wonderful, exotic, twinkled eye, marvelously mischievous, terrific woman. And she wore a turban. And not Sikh turban, it's sort of embodied dead Dolly Madison turban. And she used to give parties at the White House. He'd go to the parties, of course, and sit in the corner and chat politics, while she enjoyed herself sort of passing around her snuff and also, serving ice cream. She loved ice cream. Anyway, she was a very determined woman. And it was a wonderful, a tremendous first lady. I mean, one of the great first ladies in history. Very, very salient in the administration, very, very visible, and loved all parties and all people. Anyway, there they were. But unfortunately, Madison was poorly served by the people he'd made the defense chiefs in the country. Two key people. John Armstrong, the war secretary, an arrogant, stubborn man, kept telling Madison, the British are no threat. I know they've arrived down there, but don't worry about them. We've got the defenses. We can just call out the militia. And anyway, they won't come to Washington. They'll go somewhere else. Hopeless. William Winder was the brigadier general that Madison himself put in charge of the defense of Washington and Baltimore, of course, quite nearby. And they didn't know where the Brits were aiming for. Brits had arrived on the 17th of August, 1814, down at the bottom of Chesapeake Bay. And, of course, Madison, they were all thrown into a tizzy. There was huge panic in Washington. What on earth are they up? Where are they going? Nobody was quite clear, certainly not Armstrong. And Winder immediately started frantically looking for soldiers. Now, the problem in America at that time, it's an unbelievable contrast, of course, now, in that time was that having an army was thought of not a frightfully good idea, having a regular army. It might sort of, in a sense, bring the Brits back. It looked rather monarchical to have a big regular army. Anyway, what there was a regular army was fighting against Canada. There wasn't much down around Baltimore and Washington. So what on earth was he going to do? Poor old Winder, the military commander under John Armstrong and under Madison, had to decide what to do. Where he had to ask the states, Pennsylvania, Maryland, all the surrounding states, Virginia, please, can you produce some blokes? Well, Pennsylvania's like, terribly sorry, we set a law that says we can't do that. Also, you typical states. Great thing about America, the Federation, but these states have rights. They have their autonomous sense of pride. And so they're damned if they're going to send this strange man Winder a few troops. Anyway, so poor old Winder was friendly. And there they were, running around in circles, and the Brits came ashore in the Patuxent River, landed at a place called Benedict, terribly hot, and the soldiers absolutely sweating in 100 degree, Washington in August, cracking, I'm sure you to avoid it like the plague. It's dreadful. And I've been there in August, it's horrible.
So have we.
And so anyway, they landed, and the Americans are nowhere. No sign of any intent to stop the Brits. They marched up. George Coburn led a force up and destroyed the shallow-bottomed barges of Joshua Barney, tremendous chap, Joshua Barney, very brave American. There were, needless to say, there were some extremely fine Americans involved in this story too. I haven't mentioned yet, two of them in particular, Joshua Barney, who was this naval figure who was fleet of flotilla men trying to cause trouble for the Brits. They failed in the end because George Coburn said, I'll just destroy them, and took lots of gunboats up the river, and Barney, in fact, destroyed his own ships rather than let the British take them, and took his men and his guns off to defend Washington. But Barney was a great chap. The other great hero, American hero, was the commander in Baltimore, a man called General Sam Smith. Again, I'm sure, sorry, I do appreciate, a lot of you know this already. General Sam Smith, who really should be one of the big American heroes. Few people have heard of him. They've heard of Andrew Jackson, who defeated the British later on at New Orleans. But Sam Smith was a terrific man who actually helped defend Baltimore very successfully. He commanded Baltimore, very successful commander. Anyway, the Brits marched up to Washington, and it was absolute chaos. The Winder marched his men out to meet the British about 20 miles east of Washington, changed his mind, marched them back again, same day. Then he changed his mind again, and marched them up to a place called Bladensburg, where he was told the British were heading 5 miles northeast of Washington. The men were absolutely exhausted and fatigued and frightfully bored with their commander. But many of them were very enthusiastic. Many of the American lads, the young militiamen from Baltimore, like John Pendleton Kennedy, were a terrific chap who were very typical American, very patriotic young man, but very poorly trained. It was tragic. There were thousands of these young Americans who came from some states had produced men, like Maryland, for example, which of course felt it was under threat, being just around Washington. And John Pendleton Kennedy was one of those. He lost his boots, unfortunately, on the way down, the march. He's wearing his dancing pumps. His friends said, oh, I'm sorry, my microphone's come off. I'm frightfully sorry. The microphone's come off, I'll put it back on again. He's wearing his dancing pumps, and his friends who said, what are you wearing your dancing pumps for? He said, quite straightforward, I'm wearing my dancing pumps because I'm sure the president is going to throw a ball at the White House when we have our victory over the Brits, and I want to be at the ball. So they also, we'll certainly beat the British, and good for you, John. Terrific. He became a great American author, American novelist later on in the 1850s. Great chap. Anyway, all these very enthusiastic Americans, run by a hopeless general and a president who was at sixes and sevens about what to do, because of his war secretary, who was very bad at advising him and giving him a straightforward, forthright judgment about what the right thing to do was. So they ended up at Bladensburg, this American army, and up went the Brits, and again, no attempt to stop them. They arrived at Bladensburg, and as you know, the eastern branch of the Potomac goes up there and divides the village, as it was, of Bladensburg on the east bank from the sort of fields, still there, fields on the west bank. Good place to go and visit. You see quite a lot of where the battle was. Although there aren't many signs saying here was fought a glorious battle, because what followed was one of the most shameful military performances in American history. It's not fair, really, because these guys were poorly trained. I mean, it was the most desperately unbalanced contest. The Brits, under Ross, formed up on the east bank. They looked across the river and they saw the Americans in 3 lines, with half a mile separating the first 2 lines and a mile separating the second line from the third line. The range of a musket is 80 meters. If you're going to kill someone, you have to be less than 80 meters away. So they were completely wasting their time, the Americans. They couldn't support each other's lines. So across went the Brits and defeated the lines one after the other. The Americans, anyway, were very frightened of fighting these redcoats who just came trudging along. They'd been all through beating the French in Europe with their bayonets fixed. I mean, forget it, you just get up and go, don't you? And there were quite a few British casualties because the Americans fired their cannons at them with canister shot, very nasty canister shot, like a shotgun. Not these big round balls, but canister, which is horrible. It's like firing a big shotgun from a cannon. And a lot of Brits died. Very few Americans died. They all ran. That's not true. That's true. The third line, the first and second lines ran. I'm sure someone will argue. I'm being provocative deliberately. But I think I'm also being fair. The third line of Americans were quite a different kettle of fish. Joshua Barney, who'd taken his chaps, his flotilla men and his guns off the boats, formed the third line with some Marines and some regulars under Colonel Scott. And they fought very valiantly. Ross himself charged recklessly at the front of his own troops. British General Ross charged at the guns, and they eventually beat the Americans. They've also sent guys around the 2 sides of the American third line. And of course, the Americans by this time were hopelessly outnumbered because the first 2 lines of Americans had scarpered. Barney and his men survived for about an hour and a half. It was a very big fight. And it was a very brave fight by Barney and his flotilla men and the regulars, what there was a number of them, not very many of them. And Barney was very badly wounded. The Brits eventually moved forward and imprisoned Barney. Well, they actually paroled him. They said, look, you fought so bravely. Coburn himself and Ross met Barney, and if you fought so bravely, we'll let you go back on parole. And there we are. That was a shameful American defeat. Effectively, they had just abandoned the battlefield in the face of a very serious army of veteran soldiers. They'd found the rockets very frightening. Rockets were quite new on the battlefield. They had great big red flares coming out the back, and they found that pretty horrible. And they found the British an extremely formidable enemy. Anyway, they ran. At the White House, the road to the White House, the road to Washington was wide open. The Brits went down. They came to, first of all, they got to Congress. This wonderful palatial building with the wooden corridor between the 2 houses, looking like a European palace in the middle of fields. And 2 miles away, whatever it is, up Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House, looking very much like it does now. These wonderful, beautiful palaces, magnificently built in a sort of meadow, a village, 8,000 people. 15 years old, as you know, only built by, in the time, only John Adams was the first president to go in there, the second president. Anyway, they got to Washington. Ross would happily, I think, Coburn wouldn't have done, but Ross, I think, was a much more cautious man. Coburn, by the way, kept pushing Ross all the way along. Ross kept having second thoughts about whether he should go ahead. And Coburn said, come on, never mind. Even Cochrane, the boss, the task force commander, said to Ross, I think you should all come back now. You've blown up the barges and we've done our stuff. Let's just go home. And Coburn said, you must be joking. Let's ignore the commander's orders. And so it was Coburn who was pushing all the time to go and burn Washington. They got there. If the Americans had come forward with a party, some kind of truce party, and said, look, please don't burn Washington, don't do any more damage. What do you want? Can we do some sort of deal? Ross might have talked to them, but nobody appeared. And actually someone shot Ross's horse underneath him. And he was rather cross about that, so he got off his horse, and he said, I want the people in that house killed because they just shot at me. I want the house burned down, and I want Congress burned down. And so they burnt Congress, Library of Congress as well. Now this immediately, fascinatingly, caused huge dissent within the army. And when the news got home, one MP in the House of Commons many others, but he particularly expressed it rather well. He said the British have done what even the Goths failed to do at Rome. One of Ross's own chief aides, Captain Harry Smith, said, you know, we invaded Washington with barbarous intent. Here's a British officer, wise man, saying that what they did in Washington was barbarous, burning down the shrines of American democracy. Okay, the Americans had burned down the Parliament in York. But as I think I told you earlier, what happened in York, I think, and I think the British knew this too, they should have done because it was all perfectly publicly known, had run amok. I think what happened in York was the Americans getting pissed and just sort of burn the place down. I don't think it wasn't a deliberate act of state. What happened in Washington was a deliberate act of massive state destruction from one state to the other, burning down the Parliament. And then, of course, they went on. The White House was empty. They'd all scarpered. Dolly, before she heard about the defeat at Bladensburg, had laid dinner on the table. And the great damask tablecloth was set with damask napkins and candlesticks and the White House silver and the Madeira wine, Madison's favorite, on the sideboard. And the meat roasting in the spits. 40 people, dinner for 40 people all laid when they came back victorious from the Battle of Bladensburg. And of course, then she heard that they'd been beaten, so she told the staff, hey, get out quick. And I want you to take that picture of George Washington off the wall in the dining room, which they did. It took them some time to get the thing off, but they finally got it off and they pushed it off in a cart. And she went off, and James Madison got back, and he went off across the Potomac into Virginia to find refuge. He was, by the way, the only American president to be a fugitive in his own country, with one exception. George W. Bush Jr., who, if you remember, on 9/11 was shipped off to the base in the Midwest to save him from being picked up or in danger of being hit by Al-Qaeda. So there were two American presidents in history. One of them was Madison, who were fugitives in their own country. So they went across the Potomac. The White House was empty. Supper was on the table. The meat was in the spits, on the spits. The wine was open on the sideboard. So down they sat, Harry Smith and Ross and Coburn and all the other guys, and they sat, and so they tucked in. And they had a lovely meal. And they ate all the presidents. Now, this is true. I mean, all this, by the way, I obviously based all this in the book on people who were there at the time. And there are enough of these people corroborating each other to be sure it happened. There's one person, one White House staffer, fun enough, who denies that supper was left on the table. I think it's sort of wishful thinking. Americans, there's American witnesses as well, not witnesses, but other Americans who say it definitely did happen. So I'm sure it did. Anyway, they then had the supper. Ross and Coburn said, right, chairs on the table, burn the place down. Up it went, huge fire. And you could imagine the humiliation this must have been for the Americans who had pulled back only to Georgetown and only in the surrounding hills. And the thing was on fire. And again, disapproval by some in the army, horror on the part of the Americans. You may ask, why did the British why did they have to go this far? I think Coburn and Ross were quite unrepentant about this. In fact, many of the British people back in Whitehall thought the Brits had been too kind to the Americans and that they should have burned private property as well as public property. The Brits actually stopped short of burning private property. What the answer is they were told to give the Americans a good drubbing. They were told to give the Americans such a humiliating shock that they would say, hang on, is this really worth fighting this war? We're going to lose our capital. And that, I think, was effective. Anyway, to bring the long story to a very rapid end for you, they spent a day in Washington, and then they pulled back, and Ross took the army back towards the ships, and they had to decide what to do next. Washington, very successful, and certainly give the Americans a bloody nose. And George Coburn said, right, 30 miles up there is Baltimore. And that's a serious city, very wealthy, lots of ships to burn there too, and lots of people, far more than they have in Washington, lots of money and all juicy stuff, and let's go for it. And burn the place down as well. And the other bosses of the British team said, well, let's just think about it. Now, the trouble with that was that when they finally came to go into Baltimore 3 weeks later, the Baltimoreans had got their act together. And they seriously got their act together. This was the great saving grace of Baltimore because it evened up the balance. Washington was a major humiliating disaster for the Americans. Baltimore was a reasonable success. Dane wasn't getting overexcited about Baltimore. Americans do get overexcited about Baltimore. What happened was, very briefly, they went to the British then 3 weeks later, did go to Baltimore. General Sam Smith, a great American hero, as I mentioned earlier, who controlled Baltimore, said, what happened in Washington must not happen here. Okay, we're going to dig trenches. I'm going to get militia seriously trained in the next 3 weeks. Not much time, but I'm going to really get you guys going. And I'm going to make sure that Fort McHenry, which guards the entrance to the inner harbor in Baltimore, is properly equipped and has a good commander. Well, George Armistead, Major George Armistead, was the commander at Fort McHenry, great chap. He'd already been there for some time, but Sam Smith made sure it was all ready to go and that his guns were all set. He made sure they had a nice flag flying over the top of the fort, very nice, specially woven, made, I suppose, flag, 40 feet by 30 feet, huge, great star-spangled banner. And he had that all set up and a great morale booster above the fort. And so they were ready for the Brits when they came on the 12th of September. Ross led his men forward, saying, I'll be having dinner in Baltimore tonight. And he was shot dead. He was hit by a rifleman within 2 hours of landing on the 12th of September, 1814, 3 weeks after the burning of Washington on the 24th of August. He was shot dead. Coburn was with him, and Ross said, please make sure that the state looks after my wife and family. And Coburn said, yes, you bet I will. You fought very bravely, and what the army will do without you, I don't know. And a chap called Brooke took over, Arthur Brooke, who was another Irishman from Northern Ireland, a member of the great Brooke family who produced Field Marshal Lord Alan Brooke, who was Churchill's right-hand man in the Second World War, the same family. He took over. He was a very good soldier too. The Americans sent forward an advance guard to try and hold the British back from getting to Baltimore. They were defeated. Brooke destroyed them, and they did some of them fighting withdrawal, but it was really pretty much the same as Bladensburg had been. And so here are the Brits within 3 weeks, 2 defeats of American armies, and they advanced to the eastern side of Baltimore, and they decided what to do next. Well, what was now going to happen was the attempt to capture Baltimore, with Cochrane, the admiral, the commander-in-chief of the whole fleet, took some ships up and started bombarding Fort McHenry in order to get his ships into the inner harbor. And Brooke and Coburn, the admiral, what the hell he thought he was doing there, an admiral with the army, so up there constantly saying, come on, let's go, let's move forward, come on, we can get these Americans, we'll beat them, we've done it twice, we'll do it again. They timed it, that they would have a night of bombarding of Fort McHenry, and they would do a night attack on Baltimore. Well, they realized that Sam Smith had got his act together. They realized they'd dug trenches, that they'd got about 20,000 American militia, not just the 6,000 they had at Bladensburg, but about 20,000 Americans to guard Baltimore. Serious army. Difficult entrenchments, difficult ramparts to get over, to get into Baltimore. They dug ditches, they'd put mounds of earth, they had a lot of cannon taken off the ships, protecting Baltimore on the east side, on the hills, just the sort of, Baltimore, there's a sort of range of little hills on the east side of Baltimore, facing down towards the peninsula where Ross had landed. The bombardment of the Fort McHenry failed. They couldn't suppress the fort. It was a brilliantly built fort, a Romanesque fort, no vertical walls to break down, no places you could breach. It was a superbly constructed fort. It survived. 1 or 2 deaths and injuries, casualties, but the fort survived. And Cochrane, who was the commander of the whole overall commander, he was in charge of the fleet. He took one look at it and said, I'm not going to get in here. I'm not going to get past this fort. They've gone and sunk ships, the Americans, in the entrance to the inner harbor. I can't get my fleet in there. I can't support Brooke and Coburn, who were on land with the army. So if they go in, it's up to them. I'll send them a message. He sent them a message. And he said, if you go on, it's up to you. You're going to lose a lot of men. I can't support you with the ships. And Brooke and Coburn looked at each other. Coburn said, come on, let's go. And Brooke said, I think I'll just consult my commanders. And his commanders started shaking their heads. 20,000 against 4,500, and no support from the ships? I think not. And Ross probably, if he hadn't been killed, would probably have decided the same thing. And so they turned round and they came back to the ships. So Baltimore, with great respect to all you patriotic Americans, was not a defeat for the British. It was a rebuff. The British decided not to go ahead and attack it. It was not a defeat. When a young American poet and lawyer was watching this in the morning, the following morning after the bombardment stopped, he wasn't aware what had happened. He just saw this bombardment all night. He watched these shells and rockets coming over, and he struggled to see, as the light began to come up, he struggled to see what flag was flying over Fort McHenry. It must be the Union Jack. Must be the Union Jack. I mean, how could they possibly have survived this? And my dear, he spotted that it was the Stars and Stripes. So he took a bit of paper from his pocket, a pen, and he scribbled down a poem. You all know very well that when I talk to British audiences, they have no idea what I'm talking about until I tell them that, until I put the words up on my screen and I show them, he wrote the poem which went to say, "Can you see by the dawn's early light?" And they're sort of going to say, "What? We inspired the American national anthem." Yes, we did. We inspired your bloody national, your national anthem. And so that's what happened. And of course, he took it back, his little poem he'd written, back at the pubs in Baltimore, and the word went round, "You've got a good poem here." And they set it to a melody which was a British Glee Club's tune. A melody from a British Glee Club tune, not an American tune at all. And of course, as you know, then became Anacreon in Heaven, it was called. And that became 115 years later. Took a long time to sort of seep through the system, as I'm sure you all know. Columbia and other things with the American national anthem in the 19th century. But for most of the 19th century, it wasn't. Indeed, until 1931, it wasn't the American national anthem. But it arrived, and I think it's unlike ours in many ways. It's a wonderful, wonderful national anthem. And it should have happened sooner. Anyway, so that's it. Both sides, I think, after this dreadful standoff, both sides realized what a dreadful mistake the war was. I suggest the Americans were futile in declaring it. All this talk about America's second war of independence, I think, is all nonsense. The British had no intention of reoccupying America. Nobody was questioning American independence. It was absurd to talk like that. It was fortunate that, in a way, that it was a draw, the war. Neither side made anything off the other when they signed the peace 3 months later. And then, of course, tragically, 3 weeks after peace was signed on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1814, and January the 8th, 1815, the British threw themselves, massively reinforced. Cochrane threw himself against New Orleans, and there was this dreadful defeat by Andrew Jackson. I mean, great victory for the Americans, it was, and the British were totally clobbered at New Orleans and lost 2,000 men, including 700 dead. And that happened, of course, 3 weeks after the peace had been signed. But the war was a draw, really. If you think it was a victory, well, good luck to you. I mean, any British who say it was a victory are talking nonsense as well. It was clearly a war that should never have been fought. Right, that's it. I'll stop.